lots of stuff to buy.
Very unfair, and have really lacked any historic or realistic context. I don't think it's necessary to point fingers at any other state in the Union to say that, you know, every place there are people who have problems and there are people who cause problems. And I think that, you know, the state of Arkansas is a place that has, you know, just so much to be proud of. So I hope that we can get back to a more realistic assessment of what goes on there. Sure.
They've said, and specifically Bradbury and Mr. Stevens have said, that to a certain extent they feel you've brought this on yourselves, the two of you, but because of campaign statements about a decade of greed and just things that they feel, in their words, make it look like hypocrisy. That you were in the go-go trading, you were trying, as you said, an opportunity to make money, that just as they were, and they felt like they had been condemned by you, that people like that had been condemned by you during the campaign, and that now you were being shown to be doing the things you spoke against.
Well, Kurt and Warren have never said that to me, so I'll have to take your word for it. But I do think you raised an important question that I would like to talk about a little bit. You know, I was raised to believe that every person had an obligation to take care of themselves and their family. And that meant, you know, earning an income and saving and investing. You know, I was raised by a father who had me reading the stock tables when I was a little girl and started doing that with my daughter when she was a little girl. I mean, I don't think you'll ever find anything that my husband or I said that in any way condemns the importance of making good investments and saving, or that in any way undermines what is the heart and soul of the American economy, which is risk-taking and investing in the future. What I think we were saying is that, like anything else, that can be taken to excess. When companies are leveraged into debt, when loans are not repaid, when pension funds are raided, you know, all of the things that marked the excess of the 1980s are things which we spoke out against. I think it's a pretty long stretch to say that the decisions that we made to try to create some financial security for our family and make some investments come anywhere near there. I also think that, you know, my husband and I made different choices than to concentrate on making money during the 1980s. We obviously wanted enough financial security to send our daughter to college and put money away for our old age and help our parents when we could. But we were primarily interested in his case, in trying to provide opportunities for people in Arkansas and make a difference in their lives. And what I tried to do, both to help him and to work on behalf of children or education reform, was what was really important to us. So I think that is, you know, something that needs to be put again into a proper perspective. Yes.
Somewhat in the same vein, you were reported to have opposed a special prosecutor, at least in the beginning, and some of the release of tax documents on the basis of privacy, that you felt you had a right to privacy. Do you think that that helped to create any impression that you were trying to hide something?
Yes, I do. And I think that is probably one of the things that I regret most, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, because I've had to really do a lot of thinking the last couple of months. You know, again, I was raised to really believe that what was important was what you thought about yourself and how you measured up to the standards you set for yourself. And I think if my father and mother said anything to me more than 1,000,000 times, it was, don't listen to what other people say. Don't be guided by other people's opinions. You know, you have to live with yourself. And I think that's good advice. I mean, I'm glad I got it as a girl growing up, and I've passed it on to my daughter. But I do think that that advice and my belief in it, combined with my sense of privacy, because I do feel like I've always been a fairly private person leading a public life, led me to perhaps be less understanding than I needed to of both the press and the public's interest as well as right to know things about my husband and me. So you're right, I've always believed in in a zone of privacy. And I told a friend the other day that I feel after resisting for a long time, I've been rezoned, you know, and I now have a much better appreciation of what's expected, and not only what I have done, because I am extremely comfortable and confident about everything that I have done, but about my ability to communicate that clearly and to give the information that you all need. Now, to your other question about the special counsel, I was not the only one of my husband's advisors who questioned the idea of a special counsel. I think those of us who did were concerned about the precedent that would be set by having such an appointment made when none of the existing standards that had always been in place had been met. There was no credible allegation, you know, all of the things that usually are required. So I was questioning of that, but the president made the decision that we needed to get on with the business he came to Washington to do, and that this was an important step to take, and I respected that decision.
Yes. You represented Hayden McElroy in his lawsuit against Refco?
Yes,
Clients in the office?
yes, I was Arkansas counsel for Mr. McElroy.
And were you aware of the allegations against the company and against the Springdale office that he raised in his testimony? I know that you had withdrawn from the case by then,
Right.
but I wondered if you were aware of his specific allegations that trades were allocated by the brokers in Chicago on the instructions of the Springdale office after the close of business each day during the time you were trading?
No, not while I was trading, not at all. I did become aware of it when Mr. McElroy decided to bring his lawsuit, but I think there's a very important distinction. Mr. McElroy had a discretionary account. A discretionary account could therefore be influenced by the decision of the broker. I did not have a discretionary account, so even if Mr. McElroy's concerns were to have been found to have basis, which they didn't, he was not successful, that wouldn't have applied to my situation in any event.
Yes. Do you know anything about Mr. Foster's death? Do you know what he wanted to tell the president that he didn't get to tell him?
You know, I don't know that he wanted to tell the president anything. That's the first I've heard of that. My memory is that the president actually talked to Vince Monday night before he died, and when I talked with the president afterwards, he was stunned because the conversation was a very normal kind of a conversation, so I don't know.
I understood they made an appointment to talk not the next day, but Wednesday, and that would have been the day after he died.
I don't know. I don't know.
Yes. Yes, one question I'd like a follow-up to. First one has to do with Susan McDougal. She said that she brought the documents of Whitewater over to you at the governor's mansion. Did you receive all the documents? And if so, what became of them?
I don't believe that we received all the documents in that way. Over the past several years, we have made a very deliberate effort to try to obtain documents, and every document that we have obtained has been turned over to the special counsel, no matter where it came from.
Yeah, my follow-up had to do with the death of Mr. Foster. The way his office was sealed, or the people who were in it. There's been a lot of criticism of the papers in Mr. Foster's office that some may have been removed.
Well, you know, I know there's been a lot of concern and criticism about that. I cannot speak to that in any detail, but I know that the special counsel is looking into the circumstances surrounding Mr. Foster's death, and I assume he will issue a report about that, which I hope will put all these matters to rest once and for all. Yes? Yes.
You said that just now that you decided that $1,000 was as much as you could risk. Can you tell us what your understanding was of how much you could be at risk with the little amount of money that you and your family had then? We were told earlier that $1,000 was what you were asked to put in. And second of all, can you give us some explanation, given that a cattle contract at the time, just one contract was $1,200, for the mystery of the $5,300 that was made really in the course of one day, or at least a few days, in the first trade?
No, I can't. I do not remember any of those details. I've given you every record that I have about that. The $1,000 was what I wanted to start with, and it was what I thought was a good beginning, a good investment for me. And once I had made the initial return that I did, I reinvested that. This was a roller coaster, and what I believed was that I was getting very good information and that I would end up making money, but there were a couple of days when I lost money, and I knew that I would be responsible for any losses that I suffered. But I did reinvest, and I covered the losses by closing positions, and then I eventually stopped trading.
When you first started with $1,000, did you believe you were putting at risk more than $1,000?
I believe that was certainly possible, yes.
And why take such a risky investment?
Because I didn't think it was that big a risk, because I thought that Jim and the people he was talking with knew what they were doing. And, you know, I read a letter to the editor that somebody sent me in one of your newspapers, I think, which talked about a woman who invested $1,000 during the same time and made $750,000. Well, she had a stronger stomach than I did. I couldn't do that.
Can I ask you one more question about the $1,000, which is why the White House was reluctant to provide that figure when the news of your commodities trading first came out?
Because we didn't have the records in hand yet, and I didn't want somebody saying what I invested until we could actually get the records, because I thought that somewhere buried in some box I had some records left. I also thought perhaps I had my 1978 checks left, which apparently I do not have. That's why. Yes, Gwen?
The records released to us already showed that you withdrew a large amount of money, I think like $15,000 from the REFCO account at one point, and used it on the same day, made a $10,000 interest payment on the Whitewater investment, which would have reduced your tax liability. Was that the reason that was done?
I don't have any memory of that, Gwen. I mean, I'm not saying it was, I just don't have any memory. I mean, there would have been nothing wrong with it. It was my money, but I don't have any memory of that.
I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but your intention in making this investment was not to offset some of the liability for the Whitewater investment, real estate investment?
No, I mean, we went into Whitewater to make money, not to lose it. I mean, the embarrassing thing to me is that we ended up losing money, and it keeps being beaten like the deadest horse there is over and over again. But in 78, 79, and 80, we were still hopeful that we were going to make money on our investment in North Arkansas. And the payments we were making, which were to service the loans primarily, we knew we would have to do as part of our obligations under the joint and individual liability we had for the mortgage. But it, you know, when the 1980s began and real estate just took such a nosedive in Arkansas, I thought then, and I think the president did too, that it was going to be very hard. But we had to hang on because we couldn't get off the mortgage. I mean, we had signed, all four of us were individually responsible. If all the others had, you know, had some terrible accident, the one remaining would have been absolutely responsible for the entire debt. And so it was a situation we got into with the belief that it would be a good investment, and one that was, frankly, for us, a passive investment, because up until then, if you had a little retirement community or a retirement land in North Arkansas, people from the Midwest and South would buy the lots as fast as they could get them. And we didn't have anything to do with the operation or management of it. We just basically thought that eventually the payments by the owners of the lots would begin to pay us back and make a profit, and that never happened. Yes. Yes.
The Whitewater development was set up, as you say, as a 50-50 partnership between the Clintons and the McDougals, meaning that you were liable for 50% of the losses or 50% of the gains. And yet, by your own accounting, you lost half or even maybe a third of what McDougals lost. This is according to the Lyons report. Doesn't that discrepancy represent some sort of a gift or gratuity?
No, and let me say that yes, the ownership of the corporation was 50-50. The liability on the underlying debt was 100% for each one of us. I mean, there was no gift in that. When my husband and I signed that mortgage and when we re-signed guarantees, we assumed the whole responsibility. I mean, if Jim had gone into bankruptcy early on, if Susan had left, we would not have only 50% of the obligation, we would have 100% of the obligation.
But why was it that the McDougalls lost so much more money than you did? I don't understand.
I can't answer that. I mean, we gave whatever money we were requested to give by Jim McDougal. I mean, he was the one who would say, here's what you owe on interest, here's what your contribution should be. We did whatever he asked us. We saw no records, we saw no documents. He was someone that my husband had known a very long time. He was someone who had been in real estate business with many people we knew, including Senator Fulbright, and we just assumed that whatever he needed, he would ask for, and we didn't have any information to the contrary.
That given that you were jointly and severally liable for all the debt, and that you and your husband are both lawyers, that you would be so passive about a fairly substantial investment.
We were not real estate developers, and Jim had a track record, and I wasn't a cattle expert. I trusted Jim Blair, and it worked out for me, and I wasn't a real estate expert, and we lost money. Those things happen. Yes. Yes.
To get back to Linda's earlier question, one of the things that has been driving this is either the lack of explanations or the shifting explanations. And in terms of the way that your commodities trading was first described, that you did the trades, you relied on some advice from Mr. Blair. Later it was revealed that Mr. Blair placed most of the trades, if not all of them. Can you explain what happened? Did you have a new recollection?
No.
Why the shift?
Well, if you just listen to what you said, I did the trades. They were my trades. I was responsible for them. But I did them on the advice of Jim Blair, and very often he placed them for me. I'm not in any way excusing any confusion that we have created. I think we have created it because I don't think that we gave enough time or focused enough. You know, I have been traveling, and I'm more committed to health care than anything else I do. I probably did not spend enough time, get as precise. Different people heard different things that I said, or by the time it got passed to the third or fourth person, or one member of the press would call somebody in the White House, but somebody else would call another person. So I think that the confusion was our responsibility. We did not give you a focused place to come, and we did not spend the time necessary. There's not really a contradiction in what you said and what I said, but I can understand how somebody might assume that.
Confusions. I'll ask you about one other thing that I've had problems with. During the campaign, I think it was right after the primary debate between Jerry Brown and your husband, you made a statement in, I think, a Chicago restaurant that you never did any regulatory work for Madison Guarantee. When the letter went to Beverly Bassett Schaefer about perhaps the legality of offering preferred stock, your name was at the bottom of that letter.
Right.
Could you explain that?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that, because that's another thing that I feel has gotten quite confused in the telling. And let me just try to describe what happened there. When in 1985, I believe, maybe 86, there was an effort made on the part of various financial institutions around the country to increase their capital net worth. They began looking for ways to do that. There was a very bright young associate in our law firm who had a relationship with one of the officers at Madison, a young man whom he had known. They began talking, and if you'll remember what happened when the S&Ls were deregulated, many states were left wholly unprepared. They did not have a regulatory system in place. They didn't even really have good laws. And all of a sudden, there was no federal regulation to speak of. And so people were asking state governments whether things could be done. Those two young men thought that it would be legal under Arkansas law for a savings and loan to issue preferred stock. But there was absolutely no law on that. And so they couldn't be sure. But they decided that what they wanted to do was to ask the person who regulated savings and loans whether it was legal. Not if Madison could do it. That was the second step. The first step is, could you even do it in Arkansas, whether you were A, B, or C, not just Madison? When they talked about doing that, the young attorney in question needed a partner to serve as his backstop. And that was one of the rules we had in our firm. He knew that I knew Jim McDougall. He also knew that Jim had been a client of our firm in the past. This was not a new representation. So he came to me and asked me if I would talk with Jim to see whether or not Jim would let the lawyer and the officer go forward on this project. I did that, and I arranged that the firm would be paid a $2,000 a month retainer. And that was ordinary and customary. That would be billed against, unlike retainers of some really big law firms that if you pay the retainer, they keep it no matter whether they do any work for you. This was really an advance against billing. That was arranged. The young attorney, the young bank officer did all the work. And the letter was sent, but because I was what you call the billing attorney, in other words, I had to send the bill to get the payment made, my name was put on the bottom of the letter. It was not an area that I practiced in. It was not an area that I really know anything to speak of about. At that point, the regulatory authorities, namely Beverly Bassett Schaefer, answered the legal question. And the legal question was, yes, it is permissible under Arkansas law to issue this preferred stock. Then the question moved on to the second phase, in which I had no involvement that I have any memory of or anyone that I've talked with. That was trying to determine whether Madison could go forward. And I think that the Securities Commissioner acted absolutely appropriately. She answered the legal question. Yes, it is legal to do this. But as to Madison, she laid out conditions that had to be met for Madison to do it, and Madison could never meet those conditions, and so they never issued preferred stock. So the legal question was answered, but Madison got no benefit at all from the answer of that legal question. Yes, Mike?
Can you clarify for us what documents were removed from Vince Foster's office after he died and why they were there in the first place?
Well, Mike, I can tell you what I know, which is that I did not know that Vince had any of the documents related to our personal business in his office until after his death. What I believe he was doing with them was serving as a coordinator among our private lawyers and accountants and certain government officials like the Office of Government Ethics with respect primarily to our blind trust, because there were all these questions that had to be answered, and he was kind of the coordinator. The private lawyers would talk to him, and the Office of Government Ethics people would talk to him. I think that's why he had any documents of a personal nature in his office at the time of his death.
As a follow, why did your Chief of Staff, Maggie Williams, why was she among those who removed these documents from his office within a day of his death?
I don't think that she did remove any documents. I think that what happened is that after Mr. Nussbaum reviewed the documents, and after he did so, as I recall, I was not here, I was in Arkansas, but I believe that that was done in the presence of officials from the Park Police and maybe some other agencies. Then Mr. Nussbaum distributed the files according to whom he thought should have them. There were files related to ongoing work in the counsel's office that needed to be passed on to other lawyers. There were personal files of Vince's that needed to go to his family. And there were these personal files of ours that went to our lawyer. Yes?
I'm wondering, another question about this rezoning of your private and public lives. I'm wondering what kind of a toll, if any, this has taken on you and your and the President's personal and political lives, and do you ever look in the mirror and wish that you just never got into this?
No, never, never. I mean, some days are better than other days, but, you know, I think what has helped me in the last couple of weeks, aside from some good friends who have talked with me and helped me get rezoned, if you will, is my belief that this is really a result of our inexperience in Washington, if you will, that I really did not fully understand everything that I wish now I had known. And, you know, it's a learning experience. Sometimes a difficult one, but I think one that both the President and I are anxious to do, because we think that the reason he was elected was to deal with the big issues that we want the country to deal with. And so it is a little disappointing if we in any way contribute to a diversion from that. And, you know, that's something that I don't want to have happen in the future, and I'm certainly going to try to be more sensitive to what you all need and what we need to give you, and do it in a more efficient and effective way the first time. Because, as I said earlier, I feel very confident about how this will all turn out. This is not a long-term problem or issue in any way. But I don't want anybody to have the wrong impressions of either of us, and I don't want anything to interfere with doing what the people of this country need done.
Mrs. Clinton, spoken of the politics of personal destruction. Who do you believe are the main perpetrators of that?
I don't want to get into that. I don't think that bears any real useful discussion. I think that what's important is for us, not just the President and me, but the entire administration, to keep focused on what really will stand the test of history and what we really are trying to do for the country. And I can't really help it if some people get up every day wanting to destroy instead of build, or wanting to undermine. That's something that I try not to think about or dwell on, and try to do what I'm expected to do, which for me is working on health care. How does my husband ever make these choices? These are hard choices. Okay, go ahead.
When was your last conversation with Vince Foster, and what was your understanding of the state of his mind?
You know, I've thought about that so many times. I don't think I had any conversation with him for at least 3 weeks before he died, because, you know, we left for Tokyo somewhere around the 4th of July, as my best memory. And for about a week before that, I was very preoccupied with getting ready for the trip and doing the things you have to do. So I don't have any memory of having talked to Vince, and I never talked to him during the time that I was gone. And like every one of our friends, you know, we've relived everything that happened or didn't happen. The people who talked to him, the people who spent time with him, they question whether they said the right thing or whether they could have done something else. The fact that I didn't talk to him makes me wonder whether if I had called him, I could have picked up a clue. I just don't have any way of knowing.
Supposedly he had been in depression, or so we're told, for a considerable period of time. Were you ever aware of that? And do you have any clue what was going on?
No, and neither did people who, you know, spent the weekend with him or saw him in the office that day. You know, one of the things that I've spent a lot of time doing in the last months is trying to educate myself about depression, and my good friend Tipper Gore has been a great help on that, as have the people she's worked with on mental health issues. And I just hope that we get over the stigma that is still often attached to people admitting they need help, or that they can't understand what's happening to them. I have no doubt now, in retrospect, and many of my friends now can reconstruct conversations or things they saw in Vince in those last weeks, but they didn't know, they didn't understand, and he didn't either feel comfortable or know himself. And so maybe out of all of this tragedy and the aftermath, all of the speculation, maybe once we put to rest once and for all the fact that he committed suicide and that it was a tragic loss of one of the best people we've ever known, maybe it can do something to help other people understand what depression can do to you.
Mrs. Clinton?
Yes.
What was your personal reaction when you learned that Jay Stevens would be representing the RTC in a case against Madison?
My personal reaction?
How did you feel about the fairness of that decision by the RTC to hire him?
Well, I didn't understand it, you know, but I don't know Mr. Stevens, and I assume he will be a very fair and judicious lawyer. I guess that's what I would expect.
You're not concerned about his being a Republican appointee and a U.S. attorney appointed by President Bush?
Not if he abides by the code of professional ethics and does his job professionally. I'm not, and you all keep an eye on him. Ann?
Do you think, with the benefit of hindsight, that it was improper for you and your law firm to represent the federal government against a family friend, Dan Lassiter, and against accountants from Madison S&L without fully disclosing that you had been business partners with Mr. McDougall?
Well, Ann, I don't know what was disclosed and what wasn't. Those were not my cases. Those were cases that came to the firm to other lawyers. I've been told that things were disclosed quite extensively. And certainly in Arkansas, most things are known. And the relationship with Mr. McDougall, the fact that Mr. Lassiter made campaign contributions to my husband was certainly well known. In both of those instances, I don't think I had anything to do at all with the representation against Madison on behalf of the federal government. At least I have absolutely no memory of having done anything on that case. With respect to the Lassiter case, I think out of that entire case, I worked 2 hours as a favor to one of the lawyers who was out of town who asked me to review a pleading. And I have specifically inquired whether there was any ethical conflict with respect to that, and have been assured there was not. He was not a client that we had any obligation to. Thousands and thousands of people contributed to my husband. That is not considered disqualification. We were not personal friends or social friends. So I don't see any basis for saying that my work for him as limited, or against him as limited as it was, amounted to any kind of conflict.
Mrs. Clinton?
Yes.
The real thundering cry for you to be in this conference was 4 to 6 weeks ago, and Whitewater has subsided off the front page in the past couple of weeks. Why today? What's changed in the past couple of days that has made you want to come out here?
Nothing changed really, except I said Helen spoke, so I heard that. But I just, maybe I'm slow in kind of picking up subtle and not so subtle messages, but for me it was an evolutionary process. I mean, I really did, and I see now how mistaken I was, but I really did believe that every time I went anywhere in the country, I would have press availabilities. I would always answer the press's questions. Sometimes they'd have to wait. Linda had to wait a long time when I finished doing local interviews and radio interviews in St. Louis, and some of the others of you have been in Barnes with me and other places like that. You sometimes have to wait, but I always said, are there any questions from the press? And sometimes I'd be asked a Whitewater question, sometimes not. Every time I did satellite feeds to local TV stations, I'd answer the questions. So I really was under the misimpression that if I answered them in Rochester or I answered them in St. Louis or somewhere else, that should be enough. And I just didn't understand enough about being accessible to all of you or being accessible in Washington. And so I came to that realization, and that's why I'm here. Yes.
It's not just the press that has questions about something. Sometimes American citizens who talk to your husband at town meetings and all. And one young woman in Charlotte asked him a question I'd like to pose to you. She said that in the recent news reports about the First Lady's cattle future earnings and with all these Whitewater allegations, many of us Americans are having a hard time with your credibility. How can you earn our trust back? Is there a fundamental distrust of the Clintons in America?
Well, I hope not. I mean, that would be something that I would regret very much. I do think that we are transition figures, if you will. We don't fit easily into a lot of our pre-existing categories. And let me speak just about myself. I came to this role having worked my entire life. I mean, I started working in the summers when I was 13. I always worked. I worked through college. I worked through law school. That's what I did. And after I married, I continued to work. And after my daughter was born, with the exception of the 4 months I took off for maternity leave, I worked. Now, I took time off from work to do volunteer work. Like I took long time off from my law firm work to work on education reform, or I would take time off to work on my husband's campaigns, or I would be in Washington on the Children's Defense Fund. I would certainly take a lot of time, but I was fundamentally working. And I think that having been independent, having made decisions, it's a little difficult for us as a country maybe to make the transition of having a woman like many of the women in this room sitting in this house. So I think that the standards and to some extent the expectations and the demands have changed, and I'm trying to find my way through it and trying to figure out how best to be true to myself and how to fulfill my responsibilities to my husband and my daughter and the country. So I do think that there is some of that. And then additionally, as I have said earlier, I think that my fundamental belief in privacy and my feeling that we were being asked things and demands were being placed on us that had never been demanded of prior inhabitants of this house, unprecedented in Arthur Schlesinger's words, didn't make sense to me. I couldn't quite figure it out, and I resisted that. And I think I resisted it in ways that may have raised more questions than they answered, and I just don't think that was a very useful road for me to go down, and I'm trying now to better understand how to fit my personal needs and my own personal beliefs and what I want to do with this role for the country and the contribution I want to make into a broader context so that I can be as forthcoming and accessible as you need me to be.
Mrs. Clinton,
yes.
On the subject of health care reform, two of the most controversial elements of the White House plan is the employer mandate and the mandatory health alliances. Do those two elements absolutely have to be in a final package in order for the President to sign it?
Well, you know, the President has made clear for many months that the bottom line is guaranteed insurance coverage for every American, sometimes called universal coverage. And that really is the bottom line. Now, there isn't any way that we can think of to get there without either raising taxes or having some combination of employer and employee contribution. And we favor the employer-employee contribution. We think that is fairer, it is more familiar to Americans, it is how we now get our insurance. So we believe that the employer-employee responsibility is the right way to go. Now, if the Congress, as it is now doing, is looking at alternatives, comes up with another way to do it that they believe will work and can get a majority, we're certainly going to look at that. And the reason behind the alliances is to pool purchasing power among all of us, small business people and families, farmers, everybody, so that we can get the lowest possible cost for insurance. But it is also to ensure that everybody gets the same affordable health care. It's what's called community rating, and we want to be sure that we can enforce community rating. Again, if the Congress has a different way of doing it, we are going to be open and responsive to that. But those are the functions we want to perform. Financing universal coverage fairly and affordably, and making sure that community rating is in place.
But as an attorney, often suggested a broad-based tax as one means of funding health care reform beyond just the employer contribution alone. What would the White House view be of that?
We're not going to comment on the congressional process while it's going on. We're encouraging every committee to be as careful and innovative as they can be to come up with solutions to the health care crisis. So we want the Congress to work. Yes, yes.
Federal regulators have noted that in the mid-1980s, when Whitewater wasn't generating much in the way of income, the mortgage, and you folks weren't putting too much money in, the mortgage still was paid, and the question was raised in a memo from one regulator to her boss. Shouldn't they have wondered? Shouldn't they have known? Can you take us through your thought processes or contacts with the McDougals on Whitewater during that period of time?
Well, I really don't have anything to add specifically to that because I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. As far as I know, Madison always made its required regulatory reports, and as far as I know, we always put in whatever money we were requested to put in. One of the reasons why I'm now glad we have a special counsel is that I think we will once and for all, whenever he issues his report, know exactly what everybody did, and I can't speak for anybody else besides my husband and me.
Do you expect to give testimony to Congress or to the grand jury or anything on your activities in Whitewater?
I don't know, but we will fully cooperate as appropriate with whatever we're requested to do. Yes.
One of the things that Congress will be looking at when it begins the hearing, and one of the first reports expected out of the special prosecutor, is the possibility of any evidence leading toward obstruction of justice. Can you tell us what your Chief of Staff, Margaret Williams, and your Press Secretary, Lisa Caputo, told you back in the fall, and what you told them about the meetings with federal regulators?
Nothing, and I don't know what their testimony is, so I can't comment on that.
Is there any reason for any evidence whatsoever to lead anyone to suspect there's any obstruction of justice involved, or that the White House said anything that would lead the people to call off their investigation or to think about it?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Yes. Mrs. Clinton, can you tell us what you know about stories about shredding of Whitewater documents down in Arkansas?
Nothing.
Particularly at the gubernatorial mansion?
Oh, that didn't happen, and I know nothing about any other such stories.
You know nothing about documents relating to Whitewater ever shredded anywhere that you know about or authorized or didn't authorize?
Absolutely not. Yes.
Ms. Clinton, following up on the RTC question, the memorandum quoted in the New York Times from the investigator in Kansas City says that Mr. McDougal kited checks and that the funds benefited Whitewater partners who knew that Whitewater was not cash flowing and that notes or mortgages still were being paid. Congressman Leach still says that he's convinced, he has no doubt whatsoever, that dollars were diverted from Madison into Whitewater and used to pay the personal loans of the then governor, of Mr. Clinton. Are you convinced that no monies from Mr. McDougal or any of his related companies paid any obligations of yours or your husband's?
I know of nothing to support that, and I think we should wait and see what all the facts are, because, I just want to reiterate that we didn't even see any documents until late in the 1980s, probably late 88 or 89. And so I just don't have any way of telling you what went on from 78 to 88 or 89. Now, I think we ought to wait until somebody who is a credible fact finder, like the special counsel, looks at everything and tells all of us at the same time what happened when, because we don't have any independent information to provide.
If I could follow up, the suggestion in the RTC memorandum is that the investors, presumably including you and your husband, knew or should have known that Whitewater was not cash flowing and that notes or debts should have been paid, whether Mr. McDougal asked you to pay them or not.
Well, shoulda, coulda, woulda, we didn't. And the only thing I can say to that is when I was asked in late 88 or early 89 by the realtor who handled the sales in North Arkansas to help him, because neither Jim nor Susan McDougal were available any longer. We tried as best we could to do things like pay the taxes, and when owners of lots didn't fulfill their obligations to try to resell the property, things that were largely administrative at that point in time. And the fact is that by 1992, the loan was paid off. So I really don't know what that means. Yes?
Given what you've been through, do you have any greater appreciation of what Richard Nixon might have been going through back in '74? And what are your thoughts about him? How do you think history will judge him?
Oh, I don't know that it's time to start talking like that yet. I think that what I think we ought to be doing is praying for President Nixon. And, from my perspective, it was a year ago, April, that my father died at the age of 81. And so, I'm just mostly thinking about his daughters right now.
One last question.
Who hasn't had one? Yes.
You have said
said that when you were at the Rose Law Firm, you didn't share in any of the profits that the firm earned from its representation of state agencies. When did you begin that practice, and did that also include any profits from the firms facilitating the sale of bonds with the Arkansas Development and Finance Authority?
I don't remember the exact year, but I made the decision not to share in the profits around the time I became a partner from any representation of state agencies, anything that could be considered tax money. For a couple of years, I did share in the benefits from bond underwriting. And then I decided I shouldn't even do that, so I paid the firm back, and from that point in time, I did not share in either fees from state agencies or fees generated by any kind of bond underwriting at all.
And did you have any part of the $2,000 a month retainer? Did you share in that, in any of that?
You know, I might have to a very minimal amount for whatever little bit I did on that, but at the end of about a year, I believe, we were no longer representing Madison because, as I explained, they were not going to get to issue preferred stock. They could not do it because of the conditions that Beverly Bassett Schaefer had imposed. So, in fact, we returned money to Madison. I remember writing and signing the letter to Jim McDougall saying, you know, we have fulfilled the work we have done for you. We are still holding some of your retainer. There doesn't appear to be any continuing work to be billed against it, so I sent him a check back. So,
remaining confusion about the commodity.
Yes, Mary.
Mrs. Clinton, how would you account for the decline in the support of the Clinton health plan? Do you think that the suspicions and questions which have come out of these matters has spilled over on that and affected people's ideas about just how honestly and efficiently government can deal with life and death?
Mary, I think that's a real important question. I do believe that some of the opponents of health care have certainly tried to use Whitewater as a proxy for their opposition to health care. I think that in the last several days, some of the leading opponents of health care have even said things which seem to suggest that. I find that very regrettable. I mean, if someone wants to argue about the future of health care in our country, I think the debate ought to be about health care, and I have absolutely no problem with someone saying, I don't like alliances, or I think we ought to have a different benefits package. That's what I believe democratic debate ought to be about. But I do think that some have tried to use this to undermine support for health care. On the other hand, there has been continuing concern about the health care plan. If you go back and look at the very first time it was introduced back in the fall, because this is a big issue, and I think people want to be sure we get it right. But every time you ask the specific questions about what is it people want, I think you can get a pretty good idea of where they want us to go. I mean, people do want health security, and they do want guaranteed benefits. And the big majority of Americans think the right way to do it is through the workplace with employer-employee contributions. And I think people want Medicare preserved and improved with prescription drugs and long-term care. And they certainly want to outlaw the insurance practices that discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions and impose lifetime limits. And they want to preserve choice of doctor and choice of health plan. So if you take the elements of the president's plan, and if you look at the polling data that I have, you sometimes get these contradictory results, where if you say to people, do you support the president's plan, they think about the last ad they've seen, or maybe they've gotten one of these incredible direct mail letters that, you know, the sky is falling. It's really just stuff that's been recycled from the fight against Medicare, just new names and new addresses. But when you get to the specifics, there are majorities of Americans for most of the specifics. And I think that's what the Congress is sorting out right now. So I'm not surprised, and I'm not in any way concerned that we're at this point in the process. I think this is where we would likely be as we're dealing with one of the most important social issues in our country's history. So, thank you very much. Well, you know what? You know, let me say, one of the things that I didn't mention that influenced me is a friend of mine gave me a thesis the other day, gosh, I think it was like Tuesday or Wednesday, about Eleanor Roosevelt's press conferences. She had 340 press conferences, right? 340 press conferences during the time.
You're my 10th First Lady.
I think, yeah, sounds like fun.
This is the most important thing you could do for the press.
Well, if you have been by your television set for the last hour and so, I was going to say welcome to the television age, but Mrs. Clinton corrects us there when she reminds us that Eleanor Roosevelt had 340 press conferences, but Eleanor Roosevelt, Rosalind Carter in a very small way, and if you recall a couple of presidential campaigns ago, Geraldine Ferraro, the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, submitted themselves to extensive questioning by the press in the case of Ms. Ferraro about her family's business, and in the case here for more than an hour about the business affairs of then Governor and Mrs. Clinton when they were living in Arkansas. If you have trouble understanding it all, I can assure you you are not alone. If you have trouble wondering why the White House press corps is so fascinated with Whitewater, there are a couple of reasons. It was Whitewater that Mrs. Clinton wanted to discuss today and to put as much to rest as she could, and in a moment we'll talk to Jim Wooten, who's been covering Whitewater about that. But you come into this hearing, particularly from Mrs. Clinton, a great deal of self-deprecation. We have created confusion, she said. We need to be more sensitive. Our inexperience in Washington accounts for some of the confusion and some of the sort of double stories which in many cases have emerged from the White House. We have had, and women across the country will find this undoubtedly important, we have had some difficulty in adjusting. We're transitional figures, and she points out that in her view, the country is having some difficulty adjusting to a working woman in the role of First Lady. This came up during the presidential campaign between she and Mrs. Bush, as you'll recall. But I think most people will regard this as certainly an enormous effort by Mrs. Clinton to set the record straight as she can, in some cases to define a little more of who she is for the White House press corps and because of television for those of us in the rest of the country. Jim Wooten, our senior correspondent in Washington who covers Whitewater for us and all other political matters as well, what do you think?
Well, I don't think she added or took away from the facts that we know. I do think that that she gave us a new insight into how the $2,000 retainer that was paid by Mr. McDougall's SNL to Rose Law Firm came about. Her story is that she went to him and asked if he'd like for the law firm to check into some preferred stock issues. His story, Mr. McDougall's story, is that then Governor Clinton came to him and asked him to give Mrs. Clinton some work. As to the commodities trading, there was no new information. She seemed to be at odds with some of the people who were involved in it with her. She said often Mr. Blair placed a trade for her. He says that he placed all but 2 of the 32 trades. As to the absence of margin calls on her, she said that wasn't her responsibility. She didn't know why she didn't get them. It's still clear that she got into the commodities market with less money and stayed in with less money than most people are allowed to. And finally, on the commodities trading, she had no explanation for how, with investing $1,000 on one day, over the next 36 hours, she made $5,300. Asked about that, she said, I can't explain it.
Okay, now take off that hat that you wear with such precision trying to keep up with the details of their business tradings in Arkansas and put on your Washington political hat. Has she set aside the passion that the Washington press corps particularly has for the details of their life in Arkansas?
Well, I'm not so sure that she set it aside. She may have softened with what I thought was a very effective demonstration of her intelligence and her grasp of the facts today. She may have softened it a bit, but there are so many questions that remain unanswered about Whitewater and about her commodities trading, one of them I've just mentioned, that I would not expect that the Washington press corps' curiosity has been dampened that much over the last hour.
Well, let me just ask you one more thing about that, Jim, because she and the president have said repeatedly that they cooperated fully with the special counsel. They are enthusiastic, though she was resistant at first about having the appointment of a special prosecutor. And why doesn't, a lot of people in the country ask me, why doesn't everybody just sit back and wait for him to come up with his conclusions?
Well, I expect that, that they have every good reason to feel that way. The fact of the matter is that Mr. McDougal is still out there speaking his mind on matters that often are at odds with what the White House is saying. The fact of the matter is that every so often some new information is raised from some source outside the special prosecutor. And the fact of the matter is that over the months, the White House explanations, Mrs. Clinton's explanations, the President's explanations have been at odds with each other. And there is a considerable variance in the versions and explanations that have come about over the months. That leads to the impression, at least in the Washington press corps, if not in the minds of America, that, that more explaining is due.
Okay, Jim Wooten, thanks very much. Look forward to seeing you later this evening on World News Tonight. We're going to change subjects now for a moment because this has been an enormously decisive day in the councils of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the United Nations, and that, of course, very much has involved President Clinton today because the Western Alliance has laid down a new ultimatum for the Serbian forces who are still attacking Gorazde on the Drina River in that southwestern or southern part of Bosnia there. And the NATO ultimatum today contains 3 elements. They were first announced overseas by the Secretary General of NATO, and then they were restated by President Clinton in Washington, and here is what he had to say.
The North Atlantic Council decided that the Commander-in-Chief of NATO's Southern Command, United States Admiral Leighton Smith, is authorized to conduct airstrikes against Serb heavy weapons and other military targets in the vicinity of Gorazde unless 3 conditions are met. First, unless the Bosnian Serbs immediately cease their attacks against Gorazde. Second, unless by 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time tomorrow evening, the Bosnian Serbs pull back their forces at least 3 kilometers from the city's center. And third, unless by 8 p.m. tomorrow evening, the Bosnian Serbs allow United Nations forces, humanitarian relief convoys, and medical assistance teams freely to enter Gorazde and to permit medical evacuations. This decision provides NATO forces with broader authority to respond to Bosnian Serb attacks. The Bosnian Serbs should not doubt NATO's willingness to act.
Well, this is not by any means the first NATO or North American or Western ultimatum to the Serbs. There's been some considerable support for it, in this case from President Yeltsin of Russia, who's been very critical of the Serbs today. You may be asking yourselves why Gorazde itself is so important. Take a look at the map again, if you will. There are various safe zones throughout Bosnia that the United Nations has decreed base zones, but the Serbs are interested in Gorazde because, in part, it's on the Drina River, which runs down towards Montenegro there, and it is one of the places through which some of those arms which the Bosnian government manages to get into the country from the south there get through. And so if the Serbs manage to cut off Gorazde there as part of an inland route for the Bosnian government, which is very much isolated in various parts of the country, then they manage to secure the weapons route just a little tighter. And at a time when the Bosnian government and the Croats, the Bosnian Croats, have come together again, the Serbs are actually quite nervous. There may be new offensives against them. Now, one of the questions Mrs. Clinton was asked today was, did she have some sympathy for the way President Nixon may have felt many years ago? And she answered quite emotionally there. This was a time to pray for the president, and she was thinking about his daughters, particularly because it was a year ago today she lost her own father. We want to go briefly to New York Hospital to Bob Jameson, who has been trying to find out recently what the current status is of former President Nixon. Bob.
Peter, those daughters, Julie Eisenhower and Tricia Cox, are here at New York Hospital, where the former president remains in a very deep coma in the intensive care unit. Officials have not issued a statement regarding his condition in the last 24 hours, but doctors who are familiar with cases like Mr. Nixon's say that the swelling of the brain which caused the deep coma is one of the most feared complications of the stroke that he suffered Sunday night. And they say that a majority of patients who fall into a deep coma like Mr. Nixon deteriorate steadily and gradually the pressure in the brain causes their body to stop functioning. Mr. Nixon, as you may know, Peter, had executed a living will which said that he wanted no extraordinary measures taken to prolong his life.
Okay, Bob Jamieson at New York Hospital, thank you very much indeed. I want to spend the last couple of minutes that we have there after this quite extraordinary performance by Mrs. Clinton with our White House correspondent, Brit Hume. What do you think?
Well, Peter, I thought it was a striking performance. Obviously, we've never seen Mrs. Clinton do anything quite like this. I think that any extent to which people might have come to feel that she was sort of a fugitive on this issue because she had not become available in any form of this kind has obviously been dispelled by this quite forthright, at least forthright seeming performance on her part. In a way, the two stories that you have reported on here, the Bosnia initiative led by Mr. Clinton and this event today, are ironic because it was not clear, apparently, to the First Lady's team that the President had something very important to bring forth today, and so this event was scheduled, and they ended up colliding in their competition for news coverage. Both, it turns out, seem to have done very well.
Britt, let me ask you briefly the same question I asked Jim Wooten. Mrs. Clinton said she hopes that they'll stay focused on those events and things which will stand the test of history. Do you think Whitewater is going to continue to be a major preoccupation in Washington, or will we get back to health care?
Well, I don't think we've ever gotten far enough away from health care to say that we needed to get back to it. And even in the course of this news conference, as you no doubt observed, there were several questions on the subject. News has been made today by Mr. Rostenkowski by a discussion of possible taxes to pay for it. So it has been able to proceed on an independent track. It also seems to me, Peter, that this Whitewater case has gone to a certain point now with a number of independent inquiries ongoing and a welter of issues having been raised that until they are all tied up, and Mrs. Clinton didn't have the time here today to tie them all up, it's likely to be alive at some level for some time to come. It may die down considerably, barring unforeseen new disclosures, but we've said that before.
Just one, you got 15 seconds to ask this. When she talks about our inexperience in Washington and we've created confusion, are you all sympathetic to that?
Well, indeed we are, Peter, and one of the hallmarks of Bill Clinton in his political career, and perhaps of Mrs. Clinton as well, has been their ability to learn from their own mistakes, what she said were mistakes.
Okay, Brit Hume, thanks very much. See you later on World News Tonight. So there you are, a new NATO ultimatum to the Serbs, a long news conference by Mrs. Clinton. We'll have complete details on World News Tonight. I'm Peter Jennings. Thank you for joining us.
This has been a special report from ABC News. This is ABC.